Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Swanee Hunt, the director of the Women and Public Policy Program. This is the 2004 Gustav Pollock Forum. For decades, the Arab-Israeli conflict has ripped apart one of the most sacred regions of the world. And we've become quite accustomed to pictures of rabbis and priests and clerics praying for peace to come to the land where Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were born. Millions of their followers pray as well. And as we've seen, to achieve peace, seems like it's going to take more than prayers. It's going to take more than some man-made solutions to man-made problems. Sometimes it may take a strong woman. And we are very, very fortunate to have just such a woman with us this afternoon to provide us a Palestinian perspective on the conflict. Now, for those of you who may be here for the first time, here's how this forum works. For about 20 minutes, we provide our speakers an opportunity to speak to the audience as an address, and then for about 45 minutes, there's a chance for the audience to ask questions. Tonight, we're going to ask you to show the same respect and civility that is central to this forum and to our democracy. As we asked our audience to show earlier this week when Alan Dershowitz spoke, he received some tough questions, but always with respect for his right to respond. Our guest grew up in Ramallah on the West Bank. At an early age, she had the benefit of parents who were avid readers and a father who said, "Women deserve equality by right and not as a gift condescendingly bestowed by men." Her father also reminded her that when you liberate yourself, you liberate the land. As she pursued her bachelor's and master's degree in literature at the American University of Beirut, she was heavily involved in student politics, and she helped dig shelters for Palestinian refugees. After the Six-Day War, she was cut off from her family, but she took advantage of the opportunity to earn her PhD in medieval and comparative literature from the University of Virginia. She returned to her homeland in '73 and established the Department of English at Birzeit University on the West Bank. Subsequently, she was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. And while at Birzeit, she authored several books, short stories, poems, and articles. During this time, Hanan Ashrawi emerged as a primary figure in the fight for Palestinian independence, often leading demonstrations and getting arrested, and at times carrying wounded students in her car through checkpoints to the hospital. To address the legal difficulties her fellow Palestinians faced, she founded the Birzeit University Legal Aid Committee and Human Rights Action Project. Dr. Ashrawi first came to worldwide attention in '88 when she represented the Palestinian cause on ABC's Nightline. She joined the Intifada Political Committee and served from '91 to '93 as the official spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process. After that, she founded the Palestinian Independent Commission for Citizens' Rights. She then served as Minister of Higher Education and Research, and she was elected as a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. In '98, she resigned from the government in protest of political corruption. She then founded MIFTA, the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy. Looking back, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi says that her finest achievement has been her family. Thank you.
you very much. I think this applause is yours. That appreciated your words and the fact that there is a human recognition, not just here, but also when Ambassador Hunt came to visit me in Palestine and Ramallah. And we had an instant recognition and identification. It was wonderful to have all those women there demonstrating that they can make a difference and that they can reach out in genuine solidarity. And of course, a word that was very popular earlier, recognition of sisterhood as well. I'm very happy to be here. I have a long list of people to thank and organizations who have sponsored this event. So I really don't want to miss anybody. I'm happy to be here at the Kennedy School and also being sponsored by the Middle East Initiative, the Institute of Politics, the Progressive Caucus, the Project on Justice in Times of Transition, Women and Public Policy Program, the Harvard Arab Caucus, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, in addition to the Kennedy School of Government as a whole. So I'm very happy to be here, and it's a real honor to be delivering this lecture, quote unquote, the Gustav Pollock lecture, because I was told this is not going to be a lecture, but a real forum to engage. And of course, although I was a medievalist, I still did some classical studies. So I'm happy to be in this classical forum, to be able to have a candid exchange of ideas. Let me thank also Hilary Rantisi, who has been, where are you, Hilary? I can't, there you go. So you don't see the obvious, you're right in front of me, who's really been indefatigable. You've done tremendous work in trying to get me here, and I'm very happy to be here, and I recognize your efforts and your goodwill. Thank you. I've been here for a day and a half already, which feels like a long time because usually I don't stay in one place this long unless it's home. But I feel truly energized and empowered, and I feel that here I have witnessed tremendous energy and rigor and critical and creative thinking, something sadly lacking in current times. These are also essential ingredients for peace and for people who want to produce a paradigm shift and get us out of this impasse, out of this locked situation of mutual destruction. It is essential to reinvigorate and re-legitimize the peace option, which unfortunately has been dealt a serious blow by political developments, which we can discuss. And I wish this were true, this type of spirit and atmosphere and engagement and critical thinking were true of places like Washington, but perhaps it can be contagious. And perhaps you can be part of the solution to what I described yesterday as a global crisis in leadership. You do need new leadership to emerge that is capable of creating new visions. Hi, I haven't seen you before. And breaking the mold again, breaking outside the confines of processed language, of received wisdom, of the cheap spin of a public discourse that is misleading rather than exploring the issues. And of course, we do need to prevent this lethal dynamic from running its course. We are witnessing a series of tragic and ironic reversals in Palestine. Talked yesterday about the reversal from, instead of devolution of occupation and evolution of statehood, we're seeing the devolution of statehood and evolution of occupation into a whole new creature. Instead of achieving the peace we have been working for since the late 80s, of course, and even earlier, we are witnessing violence again on the rampage and re-emerging to replace any kind of dialogue or negotiations. Instead of dismantling settlements and the military governors, the government and the occupation, we're seeing the dismantlement of Palestinian realities and institutions. And of course, instead of achieving freedom, we are seeing a re-invasion, re-occupation, which is a very strange phenomenon. I mean, one knows when one is under occupation, and yet even under occupation, we were militarily reoccupied. So it's, again, another unique situation. In addition to these ironic reversals, we are caught in, again, a regressive time warp. All the battles we thought we had won, not all of them, most of them, are now to be fought again for the sake of relegitimizing peace. We're seeing the return to the either-or zero-sum game situation, back to basics, issues of survival, more issues of trust, distrust, hostility, and the language that was prevalent in 1948. We're even having revisionist language. I don't know if you've read Benny Morris's statements, or you've heard him, but it's strange that he was one person that we thought was at the forefront of not revisionist historians or new historians, but who tried to be truthful in terms of exposing the realities of 1948. Instead, now we see that he's not reneging on the facts that he has exposed. He's reneging on the argument. He's justifying these facts. It's something that is unthinkable, where you say ethnic cleansing did take place, terrorism against Palestinians did take place, forceful expulsion did take place, massacres did take place. But the conclusion is that it wasn't enough. That it was necessary, but it wasn't completed, and that the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians should have been ongoing, because then life would have been much easier for Israel now, that had they completed that job in 48. Now, Palestinians feel that they are back in that situation where their very survival and identity are at stake. And within Israel, there are many Israelis who firmly believe that the Palestinians really want to destroy them. I was in a meeting, a very nice lunch meeting today at noon, with some Jewish leadership, and I was really enlightened and encouraged by the fact that they wanted to engage in a very, very open and candid, I don't keep saying that term, but really a very frank discussion, in a civil way, of course, with mutual respect. And we discussed issues of mutual perceptions, of fear, the fact that there is a resurgence of fear, and fear as a motive can, of course, be very destructive, especially if it's the fear that paralyzes, and if it is exploited politically in order to prevent any kind of solution, but to rationalize all sorts of actions and extreme measures. And we are seeing the horrible Ds come up again, the deconstruction of Palestinian reality, the dehumanization of the Palestinians and of each other, and the demonization of people, instead of the return to, let's say, democratization and disarmament. The positive Ds, we're witnessing the negative Ds. And of course, we are now being given the task of rebuilding a constituency for peace that we had worked on painfully and painstakingly for decades, not for years. It wasn't easy. When you try to present an agenda for peace, particularly in a situation of conflict, you're not always appreciated, to put it mildly. There are those forces who are trying to thwart your best efforts and who see in you a greater threat than people who immediately resort to violence and to mutual recrimination and exclusion. For lack of time, I want to go straight into the role of the US, because we said we've always maintained that we need third-party involvement. We've always said that the Palestinians and Israelis alone, left to their own devices, cannot achieve peace for a variety of reasons, most obviously the asymmetry of power and a very abnormal situation of occupation. And by the way, the Fourth Geneva Convention says that occupied and occupied cannot negotiate an agreement. It is not legal or binding, because the occupied can be negotiating under duress. And when we told that to Baker at one point in the pre-Madrid talks, he hit the ceiling. He said, "What have we been talking about all these months?" And we said, "You should read the Fourth Geneva Convention." But anyway, we need intervention. We needed third-party intervention, and for a while the US was that third party, and we talked about global or international participation. It became a euphemism for the US that took over the peace process and the sponsorship of peace as a monopoly. However, recently, I don't want to go into the whole history of the US role, but had the administration really tried very hard, it could not have defeated its ostensible objectives in the Middle East more effectively, whether in Iraq or in Palestine or the Palestinian-Israeli peace process or issues of market economies, democracy, and dealing with deficits such as the freedom deficit and the knowledge deficit. Actually, American policy recently has, in a sense, worked against all those declared or avowed objectives of American involvement in the region, military and otherwise, reasons for which wars were waged and countries invaded. I think there seems to be a knowledge and foresight deficit in the new and improved foreign policy of the US, particularly pertaining to the region and primarily to our peace process. It's not just we are seeing the reformulation of a new policy, which is unheard of, and we'll talk about it later, but there is an attempt to redefine the reality of the region as a whole and to impose a neocon agenda on the Arab world while escaping the real issues within the region. There's nothing wrong, of course, with democracy and with the IT revolution and with the economic revitalization and so on. But there is something wrong when this is used as an excuse to avoid dealing with the real issues that plague the region, the underlying grievances, the causes of conflict, long-standing conflicts. And I hope we will explore this further. But during the April 14th, what we call Mutual Admiration Society between Bush and Sharon, we saw a new US-Israeli alliance in which it's not just a political identification, but it has become an ideological and a personal identification, where the US, the president presented the US as an agent of Israeli security. This is not just an unprecedented shift in US policy. We knew, and we've always said, and I think I said this here, that by no stretch of the imagination can we ever accuse the US of being an even-handed peace broker or neutral on issues. But this is a real shift in terms of really adopting and internalizing Israeli positions. So the US, as a post-neo-colonial colonial power in Iraq, has become an overt partner in Israel's occupation of Palestine. And that's not to mention the whole issue of vetoes at the UN, the whole issue of weapons of mass destruction and non-transparency and so on. But how did we get here? How did this whole situation emerge where we are now back in a situation of mutual destruction and mutual distrust and hostility with US collusion? I think the flaws of the previous peace processes and policies have come back to haunt us. It is a human attribute, of course, that knowledge is incremental and you learn, not just from your own mistakes, but from the mistakes of others. However, unfortunately, quite often we are guilty of repeating the same mistakes, particularly in assuming that any peace process can incorporate in it a sense of injustice or can actually victimize the weak and allow for the strong to exploit its power. Some of the mistakes of the past included the fact that we had the two extremes, that we had a peace process without a nation-building process, without a process of democratization, and a peace process that was allowed to, in a sense, intrude on Palestinian realities and that was allowed to distort the nation-building process by ignoring democratization, by ignoring human rights, rule of law, and by focusing only on security, and by giving the process itself all the value, as though it was the only objective, rather than a means towards achieving a just peace. And of course, when it lost its bearing on reality, when it could not influence behavior, the peace process just continued on its own, without any relationship to what was going on, and it transformed itself into a punitive process. Now the pendulum swung to the other extreme. Now we are told we have to become democratic and we have to carry out the reform without a peace process. So we said these two are, mutually dependent. They have to proceed simultaneously. You cannot have a people under siege, in total fragmentation, being shelled and battered and assassinated and so on, and yet being told that they can produce a perfect democracy. We may produce some democratic systems, yes. We may work on rule of law, and we have been trying. But without giving the Palestinians the hope and the chance to see that peace is possible and an avenue in which they can work constructively for peace with external intervention, then the Palestinians wouldn't see any use in just building institutions under occupation and in constantly seeing their institutions destroyed, their infrastructure destroyed, the very fabric of their lives destroyed. So the question is, how do we marry these two processes and how do we produce a real engagement and involvement in genuine reform and democracy, but a viable peace, not a process for its own sake. And of course, the problems with the roadmap. I don't have time to go through all the reservations that Israel imposed on the roadmap, including the modifications having to do with conditionality, where there were preconditions rather than a roadmap that could proceed in concrete stages. There were also issues of sequentialism rather than, as I said, simultaneous implementation, and conditions that deal with the exclusion of the UN, the exclusion of Europe, and the rejection of any form of monitoring and verification, which were part of the roadmap that have become now excluded. And of course, the US accepted these reservations in the implementation, if not in the text. And as I said yesterday, we saw a rise, a resurgence in the two mentalities that are counterproductive. In Israel, once again, we have the mentality of occupation, and of course, long-term, unaccountable military occupation where you have a whole nation at your disposal, at your mercy, certainly produces aberrant behavior and produces all sorts of distorted values and mindsets and patterns even within Israel. So the mentality of occupation and power was superimposed on peacemaking and ways of dealing with the Palestinians, and on the Palestinian side, the mentality of the revolution was superimposed on nation building. And these two were, again, irreconcilable towards achieving both objectives of peace and statehood. The PA failed its own people. Now everybody is holding the PA accountable, Palestinian Authority or National Authority accountable, because it is not delivering security to Israel. Even though they are besieged, as you know, Arafat is hostage and destroyed in what is left of his bombed out headquarters. And the security forces do not have their own headquarters. They don't even have their prisons. They cannot wear their uniforms. They cannot function. And yet they are being held accountable. They're being asked to deliver security to the Israelis when they themselves cannot protect themselves and cannot deliver security to the Palestinians. So the PA is being held accountable by its own people because it failed the people. It failed to deliver the institutions, the democratic needs, and it failed to protect the Palestinian people. And it is being held accountable by the rest of the world because it was supposed to deliver security to the Israelis, of course, which it cannot. And it's being ostracized by the Americans and declared irrelevant by the Israelis, and yet asked to be the most relevant in that it is always held responsible for whatever happens. And I'm sure that Sharon is very happy having Arafat imprisoned in his headquarters as a convenient scapegoat, because then he can blame him for everything and not do anything else. But to the Palestinian people, and I can honestly say this, they feel that they've been victimized in a variety of ways, including not just the Israeli occupation, but also the failure of their own leadership at recognizing their own needs and pains. And this sense of being let down by the leadership is compounded also by the fact that there is an opposition in Palestine that seems to think that it has been given the mandate to carry out actions on behalf of the Palestinian people without being elected at all. We told Hamas and Jihad, if you want to act or to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, run for elections. And then you'll be given them. But you cannot claim to be doing these things in my name or in the name of the Palestinian people, who certainly do not want to see, as a whole, the return to violence, the return to military or armed struggle, or any kind of targeting of innocent civilians on both sides. The fact that the label terrorism has been used now again, which is also regressive, to label all Palestinians, particularly through the actions of Hamas and Jihad as the opposition, and the fact that the label of corruption has been used to label the Palestinian Authority, these two, in a sense, have left the majority of the Palestinian people outside the equation, because neither the cause nor the people are corrupt nor terrorists. And yet, the actions of the few are used to malign the cause and exclude the Palestinians from any human or just consideration, and they are used as a justification to continue with all sorts of horrific measures against all the Palestinian people as a whole. Now we're getting a new and very strange creature called unilateral disengagement. Of course, yesterday we talked about unilateralism as being a failed policy everywhere globally, but Sharon came up with an idea called unilateral disengagement, which is a euphemism actually for redeployment and reorganizing the occupation. But I must stress that no Palestinian would ever object to the evacuation or removal of any settlement, or the withdrawal by Israeli troops from any area in Palestine. But the question is this unilateral disengagement a way of solving the conflict or a way of aggravating it? And are the ingredients there ready and available to be used to achieve peace? Or does this make peace a more difficult, if not impossible, proposition? Sharon's declared policy has always been not to sign a peace agreement or a peace treaty, but actually to have a long-term, and he declared this, long-term interim agreements, but no peace treaty. And he will use this time in order to create facts on the ground, particularly in the West Bank. And this unilateral disengagement plan is certainly an instrument of achieving that, because by means of this, he will shed his demographic concern that demographically there will be more than, by the year 2020 or something, it will be more Palestinians than Jews in the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, and therefore he needs to get rid of part of this demographic problem, primarily by getting rid of 1.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. That's it. And of course, it's a security threat because Gaza, as you know, is the most densely populated area in the world. It's an area of abject misery and total poverty and so on. And so he gets rid of that in one sweep. And Sharon is facing corruption charges, he's plummeting in public opinion polls, and he's being charged with having no political agenda and no peace plan. This way he can say, no, he does have a political agenda and a peace plan, and it is disengagement. President Bush, on the other hand, is in the middle of elections. He's caught in the quagmire of Iraq, and he happened to embrace the most extreme agenda of the most hardline government in Israel. And of course, we all know what the role of the Christian right and the neocons has been in creating this close ideological identification with the Sharon government in Israel. With this unilateral disengagement, we see a violation of the terms of reference of all peace, not agreements, but accords so far, of UN resolutions, of international law and legality, and the foundations of the roadmap and previous US policy. By agreeing to Sharon's plan, Bush has preempted and prejudged permanent status issues, particularly issues on the refugees, boundaries, settlements, Jerusalem, and water rights, negated Palestinian inalienable rights, and subverted the chances of a just and lasting peace, and at the same time encouraged extremism and violence and fundamentalism, and of course would increase terror in the region and globally. Overall, he has succeeded in undermining US standing, credibility, influence, and interests. And now this has become even more apparent because I'm sure the US administration is looking rather sheepish because they bought an idea that was rejected by Sharon's own party, by the Likud, even though they recruited the whole administration to try to sell it to a minority within Israel, but it became very clear that those who decide in Israel are the most extreme of minorities, the settlers, whom Sharon had historically encouraged and called upon to occupy the hilltops. Now, what are the flaws of this unilateral disengagement? We all know it's going to turn the Gaza Strip into a collective prison. It will stay under siege. There are no crossing points under Palestinian control at all. All the land crossing points are under Israeli control. There is no access to the rest of the world or to Egypt, particularly with the Philadelphia corridor. There's no control over the airspace or the territorial waters, no airport, no seaport. So what's happening to Gaza? It's also entirely separate from the West Bank with no territorial contiguity and no access. Even the PA would not be able to get to Gaza. And we need political and legal as well as territorial connection. So here you have an isolated, besieged Gaza, which is a powder keg ready to explode, totally separate from the rest of the world and from the rest of the Palestinians. This also, this plan allows for the military presence of Israel in areas that, as it deems fit, as it sees fit. It allows also for incursions as it sees fit under the heading of self-defense. And it plays into Sharon's hands because he said that there is no Palestinian partner, therefore unilateralism is the name of the game. And he totally ignores any Palestinian counterpart, any negotiation in order to achieve any kind of agreement. I wonder how he's going to deal with issues that cross boundaries. No matter how you close off Gaza, there are issues like the environment, water, even sanitation, diseases, trade, whatever. These are issues that have to be dealt with in everyday terms. Life goes on. You cannot wreak havoc in Gaza for about 3-4 decades and then say, oops, sorry, goodbye, and leave that as a festering wound, totally isolated from the rest of the world. It will backfire again. And saying there is no Palestinian partner is one way of negating Palestinian rights, Palestinian national identity, and hence Palestinian national rights. But what is more insidious is that this time will be used in order to create facts, particularly in the West Bank, and as we have seen, to continue building the wall. The Americans have agreed to look the other way and are asking the Israeli government to try to have a more humane wall, in the sense that you can continue to imprison the Palestinians and take their land and so on underwater, but you have to have a few more gates so that they can be released in Qalqilia and other places, or open those gates a bit more frequently. The thing is, Sharon demanded payback for Gaza in the West Bank, and he got it. And the problem is he turned a unilateral process into a bilateral process because he negotiated with the Americans, not with the Palestinians. And because the American president was in a generous mood, he agreed to compromise our rights in return for adopting the Israeli plan. So here we have a double kind of unilateralism, Israeli and American unilateralism, creating a unique kind of bilateral negotiations while the aggrieved party is outside the negotiations and outside even of consideration of the situation. And this effectively lays to rest the Oslo process. Sharon had really rendered it ineffective or moribund when he decided on his re-incursions and occupation and eradicating areas A, B, and C, which were very strange creatures also. It also makes the roadmap more difficult, if not impossible, to implement, despite the rhetoric. And at the same time, it destroys the chances of a comprehensive peace, because the Americans committed not to entertain any idea, any initiative other than this initiative, which means that there are guarantees that Israel will not be asked to implement any kind of commitment as per previous initiative, including the Arab Initiative and others. So, and this was perceived as encouraging Israeli violations and Israeli assassinations, and at the same time, this was perceived, and rightfully so, in the region as excluding the role of the quartet, despite the May 4th meeting that you may have heard. The quartet is rushing to do some damage control, but the remaining trio have felt that their partner, the American partner, has taken over unilaterally their role and has come to agreements with Israel single-handedly without them. I don't want to go into the Greater Middle East Initiative, but let me say frankly that without addressing the causes of conflict and instability and lack of development in the region, including the long-standing grievances, even anachronistic conflicts that are leftovers from colonial periods and leftover from incompetent meddling in the region and misguided foreign policies such as Afghanistan and Taliban and so on, without entering into that kind of conflict resolution in the region, no amount of glossing over issues of democracy will work or issues of economic prosperity will work, because reality will always take over. And I would just like to conclude by debunking a few myths and fallacies. Again, these are things that we thought we had ended. Not just the fact that the Palestinians do not exist. Remember, this was the myth of early 20th century, the land without a people for a people without a land. We are seeing this come back again by saying that there is no Palestinian counterpart, or the Palestinians are not really a nation deserving of statehood. So we're back to point zero of trying to prove the existence of Palestinians. But there are other fallacies that are serious in handling the situation. The fallacy of peace by exhaustion. Remember some time ago when the American administration said that there hasn't been enough bloodletting, that you let both sides keep at it and keep, at each other, fighting each other until they're exhausted, and when they're exhausted, they will make peace. This is an absolute fallacy. And I've heard this repeated in civilized circles, by the way, that they will exhaust each other, they will be weary of war and tired of injuring each other, that they will make peace. No, I think only the strong, the confident will make peace. People who are weak, people who are at each other's throats will continue, will not make peace. And if they do, it will be a temporary truce or surrender. Therefore, you have to empower the peace forces, and you have to empower the weaker party, the Palestinians, in order to be able to make peace. And there's another fallacy which should have been learned from the colonial experience, that an army cannot defeat the will of a people, and a colonial situation cannot last forever. And ultimately, all nations will get their independence, regardless, no matter how much you captivate, no matter how much you keep the lid on and you oppress them. No nation has ever accepted the fact of its captivity or enslavement, and therefore it will eventually get its freedom, and the longer you postpone, the heavier is the price. And of course, there is another fallacy of a military solution. I do not believe that there is a military solution. There cannot be a military solution. The only solution is a negotiated solution. And of course, no side is going to surrender to the other. The Palestinian people cannot be broken. They're not going to go and surrender to the Israelis and say, that's it. You know, we give up. We will accept the fact of our victimization and enslavement, and we give up. And the Israeli people aren't going to come to the Palestinians and say, you've killed enough civilians, we will surrender to you. No, that's not it. This is the warped logic of thinking that one side can defeat the other by pain. And this has led to another grotesque concept of the balance of terror. I think this is entirely unacceptable and must not be given coinage or acceptance in, not civilized, but intelligent circles. There is no such thing as a balance of terror. You cannot balance an army and what it does with acts against civilians. You cannot create this balance and think that this will maintain some sort of status quo, because eventually the situation will deteriorate tragically. And of course, along with that, you cannot use your own pain or victimization as a license to inflict the same on others. This has to be a trigger in order not to see that this is done unto others. Another fallacy is that this situation can be maintained, that crisis management and damage control will maintain the status quo. Unfortunately, the situation is unraveling. The dynamic would lead to greater deterioration and greater violence, and of course, threatening to spiral out of control. Nothing can happen by external force or by imposition, whether unilaterally or bilaterally through Israel and the US. We need multilateralism, definitely, as a global engagement, with Palestinian-Israeli bilateralism as serious negotiations, but third-party intervention at this stage, perhaps even to have the third party take over for a while as a transition. There are other fallacies that claim that Sharon is a man of peace, or that the US is an even-handed peace broker. I will not dignify these with any comment. But the ultimate fallacy is that this conflict can be contained, and that there will be no spillover effect, and that all you need is to do some cosmetic changes and containment, or that if you ignore it, it will go away. It has always had a way of coming back to haunt us, of blowing up in our faces, and of spilling over throughout the region and globally, actually. So we need to work on issues of serious, the E is now the empowerment of the Palestinian people, empowerment of the peace forces. And we do that in Palestine through elections. Another E that is serious. We need to have elections if we're going to change the dominant political leadership and to give the young and the women the chance to take over. We need to have engagement by the international community, and we need to reach out and engage the international community in order to create a whole new paradigm for peace. And of course, we have to emerge from this context into a holistic and integrated agenda for peace and democracy simultaneously. One cannot exist without the other. And this doesn't apply just to Palestine, but it applies to the whole region. So we have to re-energize both. I will end at this point by reiterating that there is no military or unilateral solution, that the lessons of history are very clear, and past experiences are still very fresh in our minds. And I'm sure that with the people of intelligence, critical thinking, creativity, and courage, the people I see here, and I've met in the last day and a half, that we will be able to come up with solutions that go beyond conventional wisdom and the tried and defeated methods at flawed peacemaking. Thank you.
Thank you. I will cut short your applause so that you can hear some more of Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. As you know, we have 4 mics. You seem to have found them. And this is a time when, as you ask your question, keep it short, introduce yourself. No sermons, no speeches. Best questions end with a question mark. And please.
Hi, my name is Mai Habib. I'm a student at Harvard College. At the college, we have a dialogue group between pro-Palestinians and pro-Israeli students. A lot of them are here today. I would be on my toes for questions. But I would like to know if there are any activities like this going on in the area. Are people getting together and talking, especially young people? What do young Palestinians think about Israelis right now? Thank you.
It's become increasingly difficult to carry out any kind of dialogue because Israelis are not allowed to come to the West Bank. It's against the law, as you know, or to go to Gaza. And Palestinians cannot go to Israel. It's become much easier for people to meet, for Palestinians and Israelis to meet outside Palestine, Israel, than to meet at home. However, there are a few brave souls and diehards who do come and who manage to defy the law and who do have some kind of dialogue. Sometimes we use electronic means. But in all honesty, I can tell you that the dialogue of the young and the youthful has ground to a halt, probably, because of the conditions right now, and because feelings have become inflamed on both sides. It's become more and more difficult to have that dialogue. There are people like me who are old hands at it, who are still proceeding with this kind of dialogue, and quite a bit of it is taking place with the help of third parties to transport people, to get them to see each other, to cross checkpoints, and so on. But the kind of meetings we used to have earlier are not possible anymore. Once we had a meeting of the Palestine-Israel Action Groups for Peace, and we had about 150, 200 Israelis who really managed to come through the checkpoint through Qalandia and come to Ramallah, and we had 200, 300 Palestinians, and we had this magnificent meeting where we reaffirmed our commitment and so on. Not a single station covered it. Not a single station. Now, had an Israeli been killed or had there been any bloodletting, you would have seen the media all over the place. But this was an event that took tremendous courage. That's why I'm telling you it's difficult to have a dialogue and peace. People who really, in the midst of the death and destruction and curfews and killing and so on, the Israelis came to Ramallah, and the Palestinians came to meet them and to engage publicly, to tell both publics that we have alternatives that we can meet, and yet this wasn't an event for the media. It wasn't dramatic enough. That's why we need more support for the peace efforts. Young people, unfortunately, are becoming hardened in their positions, and we need to work on that, because what they're seeing is not a way of talking to each other, but a situation of heightened conflict, of hostility, of even the rhetoric being regressing into, again, labels, stereotypes, demonization, and dehumanization. And we need to inject some kind of reason. The problem is that people are in a state of either shock or pain or trauma, and it's very hard to get them to step back and maintain a critical distance, and therefore maintain a responsible discourse. But we do try, and I don't think it's hopeless. There are enough of those to maintain at least a subtext, if not an official text, of re-legitimizing dialogue and negotiations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, Mrs. Ashrawi. My name is Stephanie. I'm a Kennedy School student. Thank you for coming here. I agree with you that we need a change in leadership and an honest broker. We need a change in leadership in Israel, in the United States, and for the PA. My question to you is, bearing in mind that every government needs to clean up their own house first, do you condemn categorically suicide bombings? And if you do condemn it, what have you done to stop it? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do need change of leadership, and the only way we can have that is through elections. So we do need to be able to have elections in Palestine, so we need to lift the siege and stop the incursions and the assassinations. Of course, I do condemn suicide bombings, not because you asked me to or because this is a public forum. I've done that before, previously, repeatedly. We have issued statements. We have engaged in public debate on the issue. And the first time I wrote about this publicly was, I think, in 2001. When they started, I met also with all the different factions. We discussed the fact that we cannot have resistance be monopolized by those who resort to violence or violent resistance, that we have to have nonviolent active resistance to re-legitimize that kind of popular resistance. We also issued recently another statement asking not to respond in kind to Israel's assassination policies. But as usual, it's not enough. I mean, you keep asking Palestinians to condemn suicide bombings, but you need to deal with the causes of suicide bombings. This is the real
by
issue.
saying that, you're legitimating it.
We need to deal with a situation that is terribly abnormal, terribly painful, and that drives people to desperation, to anger, to violence, and to doing unto others what was done unto them. This is not justified. It's not justifiable. But it is also insufficient and selective to just focus on what the Palestinians do, label them as terrorists, and say that's it. There are many... There are many serious attempts at dealing with the causes, at looking at violence in its totality, at addressing the violence that is being conducted by the Israeli army. I find it also horrible and equally immoral and reprehensible to have an F-16 shell an apartment building and kill 16 people. That's terrorism. So, in as much as I am critical of what happens on our side, and I try to address that, we need brave voices also in Israel to prevent and to put an end to this kind of targeting of civilians and this kind of brutality. So deal with all of violence. And every human life is valuable, and there is equal value to all human lives. I said this today, and I will repeat it again. There is no special value to any life depending on its ethnic origin or religion or national identity or whatever. We are all equal, and when you kill a Palestinian, it's the same as if you kill an Israeli, and it's the same as if you kill an American or an Iraqi. All human lives are equal, and we cannot have really license to kill Palestinians, and they drop from the consciousness of the world because 5, 10, 15 Palestinians are killed every day. It's okay, it's their fate, they deserve it. And they remain nameless, anonymous numbers. And then you just blame the outcome. No, deal with the whole situation, which is lethal, which is poisonous, which has produced the 3 causes of suicide bombings: revenge, anger, desperation, but also ideology. We have to address these causes. We have to remove violence as a means of carrying out a lethal dialogue between both Palestinians and Israelis. I hope that answered your question.
Hi, my name is Amina. I graduated with my master's in public policy from the George Washington University in DC. And thank you so much. I actually had the pleasure of hearing you last night as well. My question is regarding the role of the media, and you discussed this in response to your first question. I'm curious, what do you rely on as your source of information for the conflict happening? What media source? And having asked that, when you come to the West, do you believe that there is a bias in Western media in reporting information? And on a final note, what role do you believe that the media does play in the peace process? Thank you.
Okay. Well, to answer the bias, I would say yes. It's very
Towards
clear.
Israel.
It's very clear. I mean, the reasons are many. Some people in the editorial boards of very respectable newspapers here told me, well, we get a ready-made version from Israel. And therefore, the media tend to be quite lazy. So if something drops in your lap, you will use it. It's there, it's ready. They have the message, they have the language, they have the diction, and they use it. But at the same time, I do believe there is an agenda. Of course, I know that. I know that also from people in the field, reporters, whether in the audiovisual or in the print media, who say they send things and they don't get published, or they get edited, or they don't get aired, or there are certain expressions and a certain diction that can be used, and it's not just semantic because you're adopting a position. I don't have time to go into all of that, but we know. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think there is a conspiracy, but I know that there are power sources. I know there are special interests. I know that there are funds. I know that there are institutions, organizations that work very effectively and efficiently. When they get 1,000 letters or phone calls or emails to put pressure on someone, they threaten that they will withdraw or withhold funding, when they threaten that they will suspend subscriptions. These are done systematically because there are organized campaigns, and people do get intimidated, and we know that. The sources of information, for me, we use all sorts of sources, but I try to rely on primary sources. For example, in our website at Miftah, we never publish numbers, facts, and figures unless we have the names and the specifics and they're verified. So we make sure that everything we publish is verified. We have people in the field, and then we verify from different sources. We get the names from the Red Crescent or Red Cross, from the hospitals, and all that. So you have to try to rely on primary sources always, on being in the field and maintaining your own credibility and integrity as a source of information. Now everybody is going beyond the established media and the mainstream and going towards more interactive internet-type information sources that can be reliable, that are not always reliable, but they are in the sense that they have broken through the monopoly over the discourse and debate and the description and the discussion of events by providing an alternative source and a forum for discussion and debate. So I look towards the internet and reliable addresses there to get information. And it's important to be part of this interactive process. The role the media has played has been mixed, but I think on the whole, the need to give instant gratification, to give people what we call the pablum, either the soundbite in audiovisuals or the easy cliche in the written, and to accept conventional wisdom. They've played a role that has obscured the issues rather than explaining issues, rather than really giving the readers and the audience a genuine version of reality. They attempted to distort and tended to distort reality rather than give you reliable information and serious assessment. I don't want to generalize, but there are exceptions to that. I cannot say that all the print sources, print media behave in the same way, or all the networks behave the same way. But on the whole, they are lazy, they tend to accept that version, and they don't want to enter into any confrontation, either with their funders or with special interest groups, or have to face so much flack. Something I find all the time, for example, one way of censoring the Palestinians is, for example, for some time the Israeli government said that they cannot debate me in public, on television. And yet, every time I was asked to debate an Israeli, I said, fine, I will have a debate. So the Israelis would say, fine, we want a debate, but we won't debate Hanan Ashrawi, get somebody else. So what they've done is exercise censorship against me, by saying they will not debate me. And they were very weak stations, networks, and so on, who said, fine, sorry, we can't have you because the Israelis won't debate with you. So we will have to get somebody else whom the Israelis will approve of. You see, this is a kind of censorship and selectivity. I said for the last 30-some years, the Palestinians had no access to the media at all. Nobody asked where is the absent Palestinian. The Israelis and their apologists and people like some of your faculty members here have full access to the media. The moment they have a Palestinian say something or get invited to present a talk or a speech or a lecture or whatever, where's the absent Israeli? You have to be balanced. You have to have so it's like we've become the Bobbsey twins. You cannot have a Palestinian, you have to have an Israeli. How come when you have all those Israelis and all those Israeli spokespeople and apologists, you don't ask them, where is the absent Palestinian? And you don't exercise censorship on you don't even, some of them are not even questioned on the veracity of their intellectual so-called output, or on the sources of their information, or on the plagiarism in their books. I don't know. I'll stop there, otherwise I'll go on and on.
I'm going to manage expectations here. We're going to take your question, I'm sorry, and then yours, right? And then.
Thank you. My name is Munir. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you for starting your discussion with being critical of the PA and of the mistakes that the Palestinians have made. We heard a totally different story on Tuesday from Professor Dershowitz. He told us he lambasted the Amnesty.
The PA made no mistakes whatsoever.
Well, it's totally sorry. He lambasted Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the international human rights law that he now refuses to teach. He lambasted the UN for being a non-objective, implicitly therefore biased against Israel. He then concluded by portraying Palestinians and Arabs as, not with these words, but sadistic, sending their children to be bombs, to be killing other people. In this aura of deep misunderstanding of what happens in the Arab world, while I know you know the Palestinian scene much more than the rest of the Arab world, it would be useful for you to give us an image of what is happening in the Arab world in support of that which makes us human, which we seem to be losing on a day-to-day basis. I think this audience needs to hear that which is positive about the Arab, that which is good, that which is not always bombing and not always killing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's I appreciate the invitation, but I would like to give you then another lecture about the state of affairs in the Arab world, because it's going to take a long time. The Arab world is a mixed bag. There's no such thing as a homogeneous, uniform, monolithic Arab world. There are different countries with different approaches. There are, for example, the women. People ask me, what about the role of women in the Arab world? And I say, it ranges from the most liberated, outgoing, independent decision maker as a woman in the Arab world to the most excluded and oppressed and silenced woman, and everything in between. So we cannot generalize about the Arab world, but what we can say is that the studies that have come up are studies that were done and that were used by the Greater Middle East Initiative, or studies that were done by Arabs. So there is a great deal of critical thinking in the Arab world, not just the UNDP Human Development Report, but also the Alexandria Library Report and the business communities reports and so on. There were serious, authentic, homegrown initiatives for democracy and reform in the Arab world. Unfortunately, these were totally ignored by the rest of the world because the relationship was a top-heavy relationship. It's the Arab regimes dealing with administrations and governments throughout the rest of the world, and the people being left out, actually. And in that sense, a great disservice was done to the democratic and reform movement in the Arab world, and more significantly in the civil society, and attempts to generate, again, a discourse of democracy. We do have serious problems, but we are capable of addressing them, and we should. I do not excuse anybody, and I do not allow for rationalizations about our own shortcomings. But we are not genetically violent or genetically deficient in our mental capacities. We are capable of addressing these issues and reforming them, and we do not need a sort of new patronizing neo-colonial approach to how to fix what's wrong in the Arab world with an instant neo-conservative solution of exporting the... So the professor you mentioned, I mean, has been known. I don't know if these arguments are still taken very seriously, but the assumptions, I mean, he creates an artificial construct based on questionable premises. And so once you debunk the premise, then the whole construct falls apart. And what I've seen being done, I heard a bit this morning after my interview. It's as if he redefines the terrain, that he's the one in control of rationality and reason. And therefore, anybody outside that is automatically branded as hysterical and radical. You've heard that. And that's very serious. That excludes then any kind of engagement. And that distorts the territory on which you are supposed to engage constructively, at least in a dialogue and debate. And that, in a sense, is doing academia a disservice. As an academic myself, I certainly would like to see more reliable information, less selectivity and bias in the presentation, and leaving more room for greater understanding. He's not the only one who's done it, but I think academics should not become propagandists for anybody or apologists for anybody. And this is not meant for one individual in particular. There are others also. I don't think also academics must set up some kind of McCarthyist campus watch either. That is attempting to terrorize people and to prevent them from speaking out and doing their own research and cleansing institutions of higher learning from Arabists and Middle Easterners and Middle Eastern intellectuals who are very threatening to a spin that is certainly ignorant. And again, that has generated legislation in the US, which is very serious. I don't know how you've accepted this. I mean, here in Harvard, I thought you would, again, have be a beacon in rejecting or in showing the danger inherent in civil rights and academic freedom and so on, in legislation that was passed about higher education. And you know more about this than I do, but it's very, very serious when a place like the US sees fit to violate civil rights and intellectual freedoms. Then, of course, everybody else is going to use that as an excuse, as a model to go on and do the same. So it is serious, but I would tell you exactly what I told our friend up there on the issue of the media. Go to reliable sources and do not be misled by those who have specific agendas. And there has to be, something has to be done about academic integrity.
All right, we're going to take one last question, and as you answer it, would you then wrap up with your final statement?
Okay, thank you.
My name's Dana, and I would like to know why the Palestinians didn't demand a state from Jordan between 1948 and 1967 when Israel didn't control the West Bank. And my other question is what the American Jewish Congress basically asked today: how can there be peace in the Middle East if Israel's not even on the map? Mm-hmm. Several countries in the Middle East do not have Israel on the map, a state that has been recognized by the United Nations since 1949. How can we negotiate if you don't even recognize us in your textbook? So what are children learning? They're learning that Israel doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. And they're learning how to... Yeah, I've heard these questions before. When I come to academics like these, I expect original questions. But when I hear the same questions over and over and over again, but it's okay, I will answer you. By the way, I've heard these questions from congressmen who get them from sources, not very reliable sources either. But let me tell you.
The sources are cited.
You've had your time. Let me respond. We didn't demand a state from Jordan because Jordan did not occupy Palestine. Jordan was in charge of the West Bank. Egypt was in charge of Gaza. Israel had occupied not only the 54%, the 55% that was given according to 181, it had occupied also 22% of Palestine, okay, and left us only with 22%, which was Gaza and the West Bank. And they were at that time under the, I would say not control, but the West Bank was annexed to Jordan, and Gaza was being administered by Egypt. And nobody thought of the West Bank as the Palestinian state, or Gaza as a Palestinian state. We needed the Palestinian state to be, first of all, the whole rationale was all of Palestine had to be liberated. And therefore, at that time, there was no acceptance of Israel at all. At all. People felt that Israel was illegal, it was created on Palestinian land, it was an injustice, and they didn't want Israel. It took quite a few years and discussions and debates and formulation of policies in order to accept Israel on, not just on the 181 borders, on the 1948 borders, but to accept Israel on the 1949 armistice lines, i.e. the 1967 lines, which means 22% over and above what was given to Israel by UN Resolution 181, okay? And I think the time is ripe for statehood, or actually the time is running short for Palestinian statehood on the remaining 22%. If Israel continues to create more facts on the ground, to confiscate more land, to build more settlements on the occupied territory. And once you lose the chance to have a two-state solution, you're condemning both sides to ongoing conflict.
Well, you have to recognize Israel.
And therefore, no, we have recognized Israel. Don't worry about that. That's not the issue. The issue is not recognition. The Palestinians have recognized Israel legally. The majority still adhere to the two-state solution. That's not in question. The question is, has the Israeli government now, the current Israeli government, recognized the need to accept a just peace and to relinquish the land which it occupies illegally and which is not theirs? That's the real question. You shake your hand, of course, obviously they haven't recognized that. That's why we are in trouble, because they haven't recognized that yet. How can we have peace if Israel is not the map, is not on the map? These maps, of course, these are very provocative, because I can find in Israeli texts much worse things. But it's okay. People select what they want in order to serve their own interests. And obviously, there's an agenda that is inflammatory and provocative. So they found in some, I don't know whether these are textbooks, you saw them, I didn't, in some Arab countries. Which Arab countries? Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Not Egypt. The countries that have not signed peace agreements with Israel still do not recognize Israel. And they still see it as Palestine. That means that there has to be serious negotiations, that there has to be a serious attempt to achieve peace with the Arab world in order to gain recognition. Once you have peace, you have recognition. The Palestinians have accepted Israel. The only problem is that we are being asked unilaterally to designate the boundaries of Israel. I would like to do that on our maps, but I don't have the right to say that these are the boundaries of Israel, because Israel does not recognize any boundaries for itself. The only boundaries we have two boundaries. We have the boundaries of 1923, of the Newcomb Commission, of the British Mandate, that set the lines of historical Palestine, okay, which was placed under the British Mandate. And the other boundaries, the legal boundaries, are those of UN Resolution 181, that give Israel around 55% of historical Palestine. We will have these two boundaries. The third set of boundaries have not been formulated yet, because we have to form them in negotiation and in agreement. You cannot look at the Oslo Accords and see all these areas A, B, and C, and see all these settlement areas and blue areas and green areas and red areas and see these are boundaries. They're not. There has been no peace agreement for boundaries. Once we have that, we'd be glad to include those boundaries. But all our textbooks talk about Israel and recognize Israel. There's no problem with that. There has been serious propaganda to deny the fact that the Palestinians have new textbooks and have really addressed the issue of Israel and the issue of peace and the issue of tolerance. But ongoing propaganda like this, again, does not serve the cause of peace and clouds the issues even further. So we need to be critical of our language and critical of our sources of information. Thank you. Thank you. I will take this back with me to Palestine, and I have it. I mean, the message and the sense of support and encouragement and the courage and the dignity and the integrity that I felt in this room, I will take back with me to Palestine. It will make a tremendous difference, not just to the Palestinians, but to the Israeli peace camp and to people of good conscience everywhere, to know that there is hope and there is this commitment and there is this tremendous energy to make a difference. And we all will, I assure you. Thank you.
Thank you.